So the United Nations was created after World War II. The superpower was America. America had the super weapon. We bombarded Japan twice with nuclear weapons. So America emerged as the superpower that controlled the international order, world-based rules. And so between America, because Britain and France were in ruins after World War II. Their lands were in rubbles. They were in ruins. So America was unscathed as far as the mainland of North America uh, from World War II. So America was in a position to manufacture and rebuild Europe. America had the Petro Reserve currency when Roosevelt pegged the American currency to the trading of oil globally. So the only competition that emerged after World War II was the Russian Federation, the Communist Russian Federation. So after the Berlin Wall fell, America cemented its position as a world sole superpower. And so the permanent members, which there are 5 permanent members of the Security Council, is America, Britain, and France, representing the Western power when it comes to global uh, Security Council members. They control the world-based order. And so you have Russia and China on the other side of the Security Council. And so it's a tug of war between back and forth between, because Britain and France, their GDPs put together doesn't amount to America's economy as far as our reserve status, as far as our purchasing power. America uh, makes more yearly than the whole European Union put together. So as far as purchasing power, because America was floating the supply of gasoline through petrodollars, American greenbacks, and so America maintained a level of superior when it comes to America's currency and purchasing power as a reserve currency in a world that floats the oil supply of the world. So Britain and France always had to follow behind America's lead when it comes to America having its cemented position as a world sole superpower. So the only one that was competing with America was China. After Mao Zedong uh, died, Deng Xiaoping uh, grew and advanced the Chinese economy to be a free economic system to compete with America. So a China dragon rose up and overtook America economically and was starting to rise up and become more militarily dominant than America's military. So now, with these 5 permanent members, you have Russia embroiled in a war in Ukraine. You have China trying to claim the land of Taiwan as the rightful uh, territory of the mainland of China. And so you have President Obama, President Biden, President Trump, Quad, creating the Quad countries to encircle China. And so at the end of the day, this type of disorder by the permanent members, it's counterproductive to what the United Nations stands for. So that's why when it comes to permanent security status of passing world accords, these permanent members are not seen eye to eye. They're basically enemies. And since there are only 5 nations as permanent members, you gotta understand there's 193 nations that are subscribed to the United Nations. 193. And you only have 5 countries that are dominating how the world turns when it comes to policies, when it comes to the economy, when it comes to diplomacy, when it comes to wars. And the only one that end up suffering are the proxy wars throughout the third world, throughout the world, because of these permanent members using their position in geopolitics to topple nations, to invade nations, to cripple nations' economic systems. And so the rest of the world is the ones that end up suffering the greater for this type of disorder and this type of monopoly of these 5 permanent member states. So in order for this bottleneck to be eradicated, in order for the United Nations to be able to deal with the critical issues that faces the world, promptly making decisions when it comes to the world securities, mandates and accords that are chartered by the United Nations, you have to allow every nation to have a permanent seat in the Security Council. So every nation on earth should have a permanent seat in the council. And so with this being accomplished, it would allow quicker, precise actions and fluidity and resolving and expediting resolutions to world's obligatory situations that call for immediate response. But because there's only 5 permanent members and they're butting heads and they're tugging back and forth like it's some type of tug of war between the West and the East, the whole world suffers because of it. So for that reason, the United Nations the National Assembly should vote to abolish this permanent monopoly that these 5 states have currently as permanent members between France, Britain, America, Russia, and China. That should be abolished. The National Assembly unanimously should vote themselves as countries into permanent status as security members. The Secretary General should have the ability to bring this amendment to the floor of the United Nations Assembly for the United Nations unanimous vote to vote themselves in as permanent members, because these 5 states that have a monopoly currently are committing atrocities throughout the world because they have a monopoly within the organization of the United Nations as permanent security members. It's a bygone relic of World War II, and it needs to evolve democratically. And in order for it to evolve democratically, all nations have to have their place at the table as permanent members. There's no ifs and buts about it. That's when true freedoms will represent the dire needs of this world's national security issues. Between these 5 monopoly states of permanent members on the Security Council, you have America leading the way, confronting Russia and China, pushing the world ever such more closer to nuclear destruction. You got China and Russia on the other side of the Security Council, also antagonizing America, Britain, and France. And between these 5 bottleneck countries trying to maintain a monopoly as permanent members, they're pushing the world ever much closer to nuclear destruction. For that reason, I believe that the Security Council should be forced to dissolve their monopoly status and to allow all nations within the United Nations to permanently have a seat as permanent members of the Security Council. Antonio Guterres should take this amendment to the Assembly floor and let the Assembly unanimous votes make it a constitutional charter based on the United Nations credo that all nations are united in their efforts as a union to safeguard all nations from harm's way, to ensure that this planet will not be consumed in infernos of nuclear destructions. That is the most direst detriment of destruction that can be faced upon humanity by these monopoly states of permanent five members as they jostle back and forth like it's some type of tug of war. I think for that reason, all nations should be represented as permanent members as Security Council states. They should all have a permanent seat as permanent members. I think Antonio Guterres has the authority to take this amendment to the floor and let the Assembly vote it into law with the unanimous vote of the Assembly for all nations to have their permanent place and their permanent seat as security members. And that's the only way we can deal with nuclear defense, to ensure that all nations are protected from harm's way when it comes to nuclear destruction. And for that reason, all nations deserve their equal place at the table of nations within the United Nations organization as permanent member states in the Security Council. United Nations is what it sounds like. United Nations is not five against the world. It's not five nations against the world and the will of all nations. So for that reason, it should be abolished. This monopoly of five permanent members at Security Council should be abolished, because it's not five nations that can confront and deny all nations to be united. That is not. It is undemocratic. It is unbecoming, and it is unhuman to deny the world and the world populations of nations to not be heard when they deal with critical issues of the world and the issues that faces the world when it comes to starvation, when it comes to natural disasters, when it comes to saving the world from self-destructing with carbon emissions, when it comes to saving and safeguarding the world from nuclear destruction in times of nuclear war. All nations need to have their democratic right to be represented equally as permanent members of the Security Council. So all nations, by the charter and the constitution of that organization, should be based on the fundamental right that we're united. And for that reason, a monopoly is inhumane and needs to be eradicated of five permanent members bottlenecking the liberties and freedoms of the rest of nations on earth with their greed and their jostling to maintain a hegemony over all other nations on earth. That is unjust and is unhumane and is undemocratic. So for that reason, I am calling to abolish a bygone relic era of five nations and their hegemony of oppressing their manifest destinies over the rest of humanity. That is what you call enslavement, and I refuse to be enslaved. So I am calling for this accord to be brought to the floor for a vote unanimously by the Assembly to ratify the new Security Council structure, that all nations on earth will have the ensurement and the obligation to have permanent status as permanent Security Council members.